sermon series, and I've entitled it Courageous. And it links with our study as we begin on the letters of 1st and 2nd Timothy. Let's bow in word of prayer. Let us pray. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. May you encourage us this day through our worship, through our prayers, and through listening to your word, that we might be those who would begin to and continue to trust in who you are in all of your ways. We thank you in the name of Christ we pray. Amen. Some of you might be familiar with the movie series, The Lord of the Rings. And in one of the movies, The Fellowship of the Ring, there is a brave and a vulnerable hobbit by the name of Frodo, played by Elijah Wood there in the background. And Frodo was tasked with and was given a task, along with friends who joined him on the way, a fellowship, as they were called, to destroy a ring that was, an evil ring that was really critical to the Dark Lord Sauron. And if you know anything about J.R.R. Tolkien, it is not simply just a story, but it is also about a Christian walk, a Christian journey, a Christian quest. And what's interesting, too, is at one point, Frodo reflects on the dangers that he's passed through this journey, and also he knows he's going to be facing more to come. And he pauses at one point, and at this point, he's dealing with discouragement and anxiety, and he says to his friend Gandalf the Great, who is there, played by Ian, I forgot the last name. Anybody? McKellar, thank you, that's right. He said this. He said, "I wish the ring had never come to me. I wish none of this had ever happened. I wish the ring had never come to me. I wish none of this had ever happened." And so Gandalf pauses and responds and says this: "So do all who live to see such times, but that is not for them to decide. All we have to do is to decide what to do with the time that is given to us." So in other words, what he's saying to Frodo here is, don't wish away your task because it is hard, but be encouraged that in fact you have been chosen for this task. And it is greater than you, but what you're going to learn is to trust in a power that is greater than simply who you are. Don't wish away your task because it is hard, but be encouraged that you have been chosen for a task that is greater than you. And isn't it true? Sometimes we find ourselves like Frodo. We find ourselves maybe anxious and discouraged, maybe fearfully, maybe wishing that this is not the journey that I chose, but here I am, and I have to make decisions. And while this journey may be given to us, while this task is given to us, we also have to learn as we travel along, who do we trust and what do we trust in our life? Well, when I read this passage this morning, I hear this being sort of echoed in the words of the Apostle Paul to his spiritual son and to his protege, Timothy. And Timothy, if we read between the lines of the letters, the first two letters, 1st and 2nd Timothy, he was feeling discouraged. He was feeling inadequate for his calling and also his leadership. Now, we know a little bit of Timothy from the Bible, from the New Testament. We know that Timothy became a Christian through Paul's preaching and teaching. Paul, on his second missionary journey, went through Lystra, which was Timothy's hometown. And Timothy heard Paul teaching and preaching and accepted Christ into his life. But even more, too, he had heard the scriptures. We know this. He had heard about Christianity through even his mother and his grandmother, Lois and Eunice. But there was a point there when he gave his life to Christ. And through the preaching of Paul as he was going through on his second missionary trip through Lystra. Also, at that point, too, Timothy was mentored by Paul and began to travel with him. And so Paul took him, in a sense, under his wing and encouraged him in his gifts of ministry. At that point, there was a time in which Paul said, "No, Timothy, you've been helping me out, but I'm going to assign you a congregation. Here is a congregation I want you to go and be a pastor to, and to be involved with, and to lead." And this was the congregation that was in Ephesus. And so we know a little bit about Timothy's journey with Paul and the relationship that they had. We also know that Timothy wasn't like Paul in his personality. Timothy was a little bit more introverted. He was maybe a little bit more of a reserved personality. And even in 1 Corinthians, Paul writes to the Corinthian church saying, if you hear about Timothy, encourage him in the faith. Because there's times in Timothy's life where, and we get this sense in his own leadership, that he was dealing with discouragement in his calling and in his leadership. We also know this, that Timothy, as he worked with the church in Ephesus, was going through a very difficult time. He was dealing with false teachers. He was dealing with those who were distorting the gospel message of Jesus. He was dealing also with the minority who, in the congregation, who were maybe more interested in creating controversy. And so there were those who were not only challenging his leadership, but they were also saying, "Timothy, you're inexperienced. You lack wisdom. You lack knowledge in order to be a leader in this place." And given all of this, it got back to Paul. And he knew that his young friend was being discouraged and doubting himself, his calling, his leadership, his faith. And so like a good friend, and like a mentor who comes alongside of someone, and today we maybe use this language and a spiritual coach, in a sense, Paul comes alongside of Timothy. And he wants to remind Timothy of a few things that are helpful for him as he moves forward, as he lives his life in his calling as a leader within this congregation, as a pastor to this people. And maybe for us too, it's also, and we're going to get some principles here in our own lives, of the ways that we, maybe if we're feeling discouraged with our task or our calling in life, maybe even our walk with God, maybe even we're putting pressure on ourselves to perform. Paul, I think, has some good words to his protege, his friend, his son in the faith, Timothy, that I think will help us over this series, and in particular even today. So what does Paul say to Timothy, and how does he encourage Timothy in his walk, his own personal walk of faith, but also as he desires to be a good leader, a good person, somebody who is able to minister in that context? Well, I think the first thing he says is this, and let's say this together. Trust the message that you know is true. Trust the message of the love of Jesus. Notice what he says, and this is a little bit before what Jan read for us, but this is Paul's reiteration of Timothy's call, but also, indeed, to stick to the message that he knows. He says this, "I urge you, Timothy, as I did when I was on my way to Macedonia, to remain in Ephesus, so that you may instruct certain people not to teach any different doctrine, and not to occupy themselves with myths and endless genealogies." That was a part of the Greek philosophy of that time and that place that promotes speculations rather than a divine training that is known by faith. In other words, Timothy, you've been trained, you've been mentored, you know the message of grace. Paul goes on and says this, "But the aim of such instruction is this, is love that comes from a pure heart, a good conscience, and a sincere faith." As I indicated just at the beginning here, Timothy was dealing with those who were more interested in controversy. They were more interested in debating. And that was causing some disunity within the congregation itself. Maybe even those on the outside were looking at this congregation saying, they are followers of Jesus, but there's a lot of disunity that's taking place within that. And in some ways, too, a lot of this controversy and debate was really more ego-driven. It was dealing with attention-seeking, rather than trying to build up the congregation. Those of you who are maybe leaders in various settings, sometimes you know that. Sometimes you realize that, yes, everything is not perfect, But there's also a part of it too where you want to focus in on the positive things, the strengths of your staff. You want to focus in on the positive things that are going on with those whom you are called to lead. That doesn't mean you ignore that which is not good. But at the same time, you also don't want to allow those who focus in on that to sort of micromanage that controversy and that speculation. And in fact, Paul, he also knows, he names names. Can I say that? Even in this passage. He knows some of the troublemakers even within this environment, within this congregation. And he names names. He says, Hymenaeus and Alexander, watch out for those two. Be careful. Because they're distracting new believers with philosophies and ideas and interpretations that are not helpful. It's all about them. It's not about the community of faith. It's causing disunity and disharmony. And so Paul essentially tells Timothy, in your leadership, steer clear of being distracted of these things. Focus on what you know to be true and good, the message of faith in God and Christ. And the aim here is love. Keep that in your focus, the love of Jesus. And he says these things. It comes from a pure heart. It comes from a good conscience. And it comes from a sincere faith. Timothy, it's not about you. It's about the love of Jesus. I like that word sincere. In many ways, it means this. It says saying and living in a way that one is genuine and that one shares genuinely what they feel and what they believe. And here's a caveat to that as well, too. It is also done with respect. You might disagree with someone. You might not necessarily share the same opinion, but do it with respect to those around you, without the pretense of hypocrisy or of judgment. And so this is really Paul's leadership, first maybe point here, principle of leadership to Timothy, who's feeling discouraged by this. He says, trust the true message of the love of Jesus Christ and keep teaching and living out that message in your life. And later on, actually, in one of his letters, Paul says, if you stick to that message, people will see your sincerity of heart and they will follow. Not just you, but they will want to know more about Christ. Amen? Yeah. God will transform the hearts of those who hear. So trust the true message of the love of Jesus, Paul says. There's a second thing that he goes on, and actually becomes very personal. He says this, and let's say this together. Trust in God's grace, all because of Jesus. Timothy was quite possibly measuring himself to those who might have seemed to be more spiritual than he was. Maybe he was feeling that, wow, who am I? My CV is really nothing compared to some of the intellects that are even in this congregation. Those who maybe feel that they are wiser than me. And so sometimes what happens is that when you sort of start to think like that, then you see yourself, you see not only your own leadership as a failure, but you also see yourself as what? As a failure. As inadequate. And it's interesting what Paul says to his protege, Timothy. He says this, and it's a word of thanks. He says this, I'm so grateful to Christ Jesus for making me adequate to do this work. He went out on a limb, entrusting me with his ministry. The only credentials I brought to it were ineffective, witch hunts, and arrogance. But I was treated mercifully because I didn't know what I was doing. This is the Apostle Paul talking, right? We make him up. I don't know what I was really doing at first. Didn't know who I was, who I was doing it against. He goes on, grace mixed with faith and love poured over me and into me. And then he says this little phrase, and all what? Because of Jesus. Paul could have said to Timothy, well, just look at the letters behind my name. I have all these years of theological training And look at all this experience that I have in my missionary journeys. And look at all these sermons that I've preached. I got a whole file full of them in my office. Here